Hey, let's get started here. Again, thank you everyone for joining us at our application workshops. We'll continue to do these as new emerging markets start coming online. It's important to kind of start early, as everyone knows. Fresno, they're still they just finalized some adopting the new ordinance, and their applications are going to be released sometime soon. But it's nice to kind of get a head start here, start seeing what the market's like. So we have an awesome guest today. We have Miguel Arias, Council President of Fresno. He'll be going over some of the processes they've been through in adopting this ordinance and highlight some of the main points. We'll have Yonker follow up, talk about how to prepare for the application, what some of the tips and tricks that you can do to be better prepared for that. And then I'll finalize everything, kind of going over what our analysis has been like in the city of Fresno, some of the market analysis, a visualization of the regulations, and then touch on some of the viable properties that are there and so forth. So again, thank you for everybody joining us. And Miguel, thank you for being a guest today.
Thank you for having me this morning, I think it is, or mid-afternoon. I forget my days and seasons already with this long COVID-19 experience for the state and the country. So let me start off by just giving you some context on our city in terms of the cannabis industry. We in Fresno are the place first, the birth of 3 strikes and you're out. It's also the place where folks tend to be very and extremely hard on any perceived criminal elements. And it's been a place where we've had to go down the path of an uphill kind of battle just to get to a point of being able to get to legalizing the cannabis industry. A little bit of background: after the passage of the prop statewide, the city took action in 2018 to also begin the process of taxation, and passed afterwards a set of policies that would set the foundation for the industry in Fresno. In 18, though, we also had a significant election locally as part of the national and local blue wave, where a younger group and more progressive group of council members were elected, starting with myself and a couple of my colleagues. So we went ahead and revisited the original ordinance that the city had passed to regulate the industry, and we made what we believe are much better improvements to the original one that struggled to get through the council. We too struggled to get the necessary support. An early version of it was vetoed by our mayor. We overcame that veto and put in place this final ordinance that we'll cover today. So with that, let's go to the next slide. Let's go one more. There you go. So in January of 19, as a new council came in, we established an ad hoc committee. We met a series of times. That ad hoc committee was chaired by myself, also Councilmember Soria, and former Council President Capriolio. We began developing the new revisions to the ordinance that were eventually adopted. This last year, we also started to advertise and develop the project management position, an internal position that would help bring this work to fruition. Of course, we went through multiple revisions and readings of the ordinance, and we finally had those final ordinance adopted last year. So with that, we're now kind of in the phase of, go to the next slide, in the phase of the EIR. We did take into account in all the revisions that we made the changes in state law. So a lot of it was predicated on changes to state law. These are some of the changes that we considered: the equity licenses, the unionized workforce, the state tax deductions that were taken into account. In our city, our tax rate is probably 50% lower than our neighboring jurisdictions. So part of the benefit of being the last major city to regulate the industry, and really one of the last cities locally in the valley to regulate the industry, is that we were able to learn a lot of lessons from our neighbors up and down the state. The council committee and a few council members actually took several visits across the state: Oakland, Sacramento, LA, Long Beach, San Diego, to go learn what it is that those cities did well, what resulted in litigation, what were assumptions that didn't hold water, and also study their taxation rate. So our taxation rate will be set to 4%, which is about, for some times 50 to 60% deduction from even our neighboring cities locally in the Valley. Next slide, please. We also, so in the world of Fresno revisions, it's all right. Here are some of the revisions that we made. Some revisions that were made to garner community support and neighborhood support in the backdrop of a city that typically is, very anti cannabis. It's extremely conservative around criminal legislation. Our city and our county tends to oppose any reform to the criminal justice system statewide. So one of the things we started out with is the original ordinance said that people would be notified upon approval of a license being granted. We modified that to say, like any liquor license or any other conditional use permit, the neighborhood within 1,000 feet would be notified at the point of application, so that everybody has sufficient time to express their concerns. The applicants have sufficient time to mitigate those concerns. We found this as a best practice, that when you start off with community and neighborhood support, it makes the process easier. So consistent with our ABC license and other conditional use permits, we now will be notifying residents upon receiving an application so that they know what's going on. We also found some errors in the original ordinance that left out a lot of mixed use neighborhoods and other zoning areas that should be available for this industry. So Fresno has become one of the few cities in the state, in the Valley, where we're now doing a lot more mixed use and higher density. So first floor is commercial retail, second through the fifth floor is residential. We want to make sure that those places were also available for this industry. Go to the next slide, please. So notification, approval process was another big one. The initial ordinance had a lot of requirements around the industry. For example, they required every single employee in the industry to have a background check and a city work permit. We removed that requirement from the revisions. Now the owners and operators would have a police background check and a city work permit. That allows us as a city not to be the HR provider for the industry, but to ensure that the primary players and operators, we know who they are. We also changed the change of use or ownership license will also be done annually at the time that the annual retail permits are granted. So that makes it easier for the industry, where we don't have to constantly be taking into account changes of ownership or operators. We also worked on the business permit side of it to make it consistent with other industries in the city. So we did say that once the applications are up and available, we would have a no contact provision. So once we post applications, it should be very clear to the industry, they're not allowed to have any contact with the elected officials, because ultimately the city manager will recommend approval, and the city council in the final revisions gets to overturn any approval by the city manager. So we are allowing the city council that final check and balance, but with that, we need to make sure that we're clear of any conflicts during the process. And the last part, which is unique to in our city, is the conditional use permits. We established the permits, your retail license will be renewed annually, but the conditional use permit will be renewed every 5 years. Typically, conditional use permits are good for the life of the conditional use permit, but we wanted a provision in there that allowed the neighborhood to revisit the operation of the facility every 5 years. So if providers commit to, not having an impact on the neighborhood, on making sure they operate correctly, then the city doesn't have to actively work to revoke the CUP permit if that's not followed. Instead, the neighborhood would essentially have an opportunity every 5 years to raise the concerns that they may have with the operation of the facility. And the council would also have the opportunity to no longer renew the CUPs. That also allows, in our view, landowners, landlords to have a value once all these tenant improvements are made. So if provider one goes out of business in year 3, then they still have 2 years left to get another provider to operate the facility. This is key because we have so many competing buffer concerns that we have to, considerations that we have to take into account, that once we find a facility in the right location that has the right, conditions, we want to make sure we at least maintain that ability for that facility to continue to operate beyond one license holder on an annual basis. Next slide, please. We took on the social equity work. This is probably the heaviest lift for the city. The original language said that social equity would be determined by the applicant. So it allowed the applicant to essentially define what social equity meant for them. And it didn't set aside any licenses for social equity applicants. That was a huge shift for us. That's probably the most controversial portion of the ordinance. In Fresno and in our industry, our kind of local economy, we have a lot of ag interest who want to come into the industry, and they would like to be awarded all the licenses because, this ag is kind of the backbone of our local economy. So you had a lot of farmers saying social equity, requirements for hiring, requirements for operating. We don't want any of that. We just want you to give the licenses to people who have a history and the capital to do business in this industry, which by default would be them. So you can move on to the next slide. We changed the elements of social equity. In essence, what we said is we're going to define the social equity values and elements that we believe are necessary. One of the big areas was we want to make sure people are hired locally. We want to make sure that those with previous cannabis convictions also are hired. We want you to hire the hard to serve, the unemployed, the underemployed. We want you to, we'll give you extra, points if you take a dilapidated building and reinvest in it. If you go into a neighborhood and, have a positive impact in that neighborhood, in that area. So we essentially said, of the up to 21 retail licenses, and up to 7 of them will be available for social equity applicants. We also, go ahead to the next slide. We also covered some key elements to the qualifications to be an equity applicant. Some of these mirror what other jurisdictions have done. We did take a couple of lessons learned around, folks being used as straw applicants. So we took that into account. We included the Cal Enviro zip code because that essentially does a really good job of covering the significant portion of our city. Essentially, 2/3 of our city is, of low income. So that Cal Enviro zip code calculation allows us to prioritize folks in those zip codes. As I indicated, from 1 to 7 licenses would be awarded based on social equity applicants, and one of up to 8 of them for the commercial licenses. The ordinance does allow us it envisioned us having 3 rounds of license awardees, 7 on first year, 7 second year, and 7 more on the third year with council approval. Given that we're so late at the game, it also envisioned that the first year would be medicinal only. But since we've taken so much time, when we go ahead and put the licenses out, we're probably going to put in, for sure, medicinal and retail at the same time, but probably up to 21 licenses from day one, because we anticipate getting quite a bit of interest. With that, we are still going to be debating the social equity reinvestment back into the city. The taxation ordinance that was passed by the voters called out that 10% of the money would be reinvested in some social equity work. That will be developed once we start actually taking in the revenue from the industry. Next slide, please. As you can see, here's some of the first awardees from the social equity funds at the state. The state just had their second wave of awards. The City of Fresno is not listed on there because we still were late in setting up this industry. So you can go to the next slide. Our budget does take into account revenue from this industry. Our last year's budget included $500,000. This year includes 1.5 and up to what we anticipate would be $5 to $10 million in ongoing years. The voter approved ordinance does say that 10% of the money must be reinvested back in community benefit. That work will begin once we start, after we start awarding licenses and establishing a committee to provide us some feedback on that. Next slide, please. So next steps for us is we are in the environmental report phase. We just published the environmental report, the citywide EIR that we did for cannabis on Friday of last week. It'll be flying out there for 45 days. This is unique to our city. Most cities in our region just did most of them didn't even do an environmental assessment of the applicants. Some did an environmental assessment of each project. We chose to spend the time and the expense to do a full EIR citywide so that they wouldn't have to slow down the process for each individual applicant. So the applications, when we make them available, which we anticipate being this summer, then applicants won't have to do individual EIRs as part of their application process. So the EIR is out in the street. We'll be publicizing it for, I think we have about 40 days left in it. After that, we'll take the comments, we'll bring it back to council for final approval. And once the council approves the final EIR, which we anticipate in June, then we anticipate this summer being able to publicize the applications. We've already hired our cannabis manager in-house. So the staffing is in place, the EIR is being flown, and we should be on schedule. We made it a point during this COVID-19 not to slow down any operations in the planning department and the city, including this work with the cannabis industry. So with that, that's what I anticipate from our city. We will be in a position to start accepting applications in July and hopefully be in a position to award licenses in the fall. With that, I will take any questions if you have them.
Thank you, Council President. I do see questions coming in. What we'll do is that we'll take the Q&A at the end. So right now I'll transition over to Jared and talk a little bit about there and what we have in our portal. And then we'll take questions at the end. So Council President, thank you so much. That's very, very helpful. There's a lot of good information on there. And we'll make sure to share this on the blog with a lot more information that we're gathering as well. And we'll also stay in tune what is on any of the updates that's going on with the city. So bear with me while I transition here. Okay, so if you guys don't know about our portal yet or our CREC network, this is everything that's involved with that. This is our portal kind of highlighting a lot of different things we have in here, but we're going to touch on our regulatory maps currently. And we do have an analysis for the city of Fresno. So I'll pull this up and then Jared, I'll let you kind of kick off on some of the tips and tricks we can do for the applications and what's going on with some of the regs.
Absolutely. Thank you again, Councilman Miguel. This was, you are speaking on the permitting process from a point of experience that is well appreciated. I have worked with over 100 municipalities on cannabis permitting application processes, and certainly there's a great deal to be learned from both the success and failures of other municipalities. With that said, I'm going to kind of go over what I had noticed from the standpoint of compliance with regards to the ordinance and its amendments. I'll try not to cover too much that has already been discussed. The Fresno City Ordinance and its subsequent amendments have laid a good amount of the groundwork for the city's highly anticipated cannabis permitting process. The permitting in Fresno is going to consist of both land use entitlement and regulatory permitting. With the land use, a conditional use permit, specifically a commercial cannabis business, must obtain a conditional use permit from the Planning and Development Department. Then when we move over to the regulatory, something that I don't think we had discussed yet was the allotment for cannabis use permits. So I believe as of right now, our retail is going to issue up to 14 dispensary licenses with an additional potential 7 dispensaries possible upon council resolution in the future. Another thing to mention, specific about Fresno's cannabis permitting, is that delivery will be a function of retail. So there will not be a specific delivery license, but rather delivery as a function of the permit for retail dispensary. Cultivation, manufacturing, and distribution licenses will be issued in a total allotment of 16, with no specific number of each type of license being required, so long as the total number of commercial cannabis permits issued for all 3 business types does not exceed the total of 16. And finally, we have testing for testing laboratories, in which there will be no limit on testing permits issued. The permittee selection will be handled by the city manager. I believe it will probably be in the very near future that we see kind of the guidelines and review criteria for top applicants. Once submitted to the city, it is an estimated 10 days until the city manager will make a determination to issue the commercial cannabis permit. At that point, a notice of determination will be sent out to owners within a minimum 1,000-foot radius of the business. And then finally, the official issuance of the commercial cannabis business permit is conditioned upon the prevailing candidates obtaining all required land use approvals and cannabis business license tax certificates. So let's talk a little bit about what we might see as requirements for this application. This is greatly speculated off of the requirements for some of the cities already mentioned that were studied in so as to put together the Fresno cannabis program. We can certainly expect a detailed security plan, as all cannabis businesses shall implement sufficient security measures to deter and prevent unauthorized entrance to areas containing cannabis products, as well as to deter and prevent the theft of cannabis and cannabis products. An operations plan, depending on the operations that you will be applying for a permit on, to meet or exceed minimum legal municipal and state standards based on said operation. This would include your operation procedures, your SOPs, inventory procedures, and accounting software. There will certainly be an environmental piece to it, which we will likely, which you will also see reflected in the required state licensing that would follow up to your municipal permitting. There's going to be a social policy, which is pretty interesting here. Standard would be the labor peace agreement for employees 10 or more, or the willingness to enter into one if you do not start with 10 employees. Social responsibility plan, employment of socially impacted individuals, which was kind of already discussed by a council member. Likewise with the social equity, I actually think that the layout that the council member presented was a little bit cleaner than this one that I've pulled from the ordinance, so I won't spend too much time going over that. Ownership, certainly permit owners must pass municipal background check process as is standard with most municipal permits. Here's something else that is of great interest to a lot of our leads coming in, and that is the ability for the permit to change ownership. And per the ordinance, it is possible to change not only the location, but also the ownership of a permit. It is required that you apply with the city manager for this, and that it must take place at the same time as the application renewal, and that the city manager will approve or deny within 15 calendar days, in which case you would then have an additional 2 weeks to notify the state regulating agency for that same change of ownership. These are all things that we are quite comfortable with navigating. We're looking forward to staying close with the City of Fresno as it develops their application and creates that, release that to the public. For anybody on this call that has a property or is interested in becoming a cannabis operator within the City of Fresno, this is the prime time to get involved. This is definitely not too soon to start on the process of the entitlement for the property, and certainly with what I know we can expect on the regulatory permit, it is not too soon for us to get started on building that out as well. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn this presentation back over to Erich.
Thank you, Jared. And you raised some good points there. It's not too early. We've been actually following the City of Fresno for some time now to that whole process. And I think it's been almost a couple of years now. So we always suggest kind of getting into a city early on. So we even offer a predictive analysis, which is actually what we did do for the City of Fresno very early on to identify where are the most viable properties or where the properties are going to be most likely viable. And then from there, we followed along with them during that draft regulations, made sure everything was staying up to date there. And then, of course, when they finalized and they adopted the final ordinance, make sure to keep everything updated. So, but we do provide on our reg maps, and these are for our network members and everything we have in our portal. We provide viable properties. Things are out for sale, lease, off market, and then also leases that are expiring within a year. Those ones are great because if you're going through the entitlement process and typically property owners will like to have some type of holding costs or some type of commitment, you're able to negotiate at much lower holding costs if they have a tenant in place. So this is our reg map for the City of Fresno. Here we have a little bit of the reg summary, which we touched a lot of these points. There is a cannabis innovation hub. And they had a couple different versions of this, but they just finalized what that looks like. So it is the half mile of the State Route of 99 between Shaw Avenue, Clinton Avenue, 1 mile from the State Route 99 north of Shaw Avenue. So we'll show you what that looks like. It is in the industrial and heavy industrial zones. And again, what we do is kind of lay things out for you with really what affects the real estate, because that's kind of what we're focused on, is identifying viable properties that are going to work for entitlement. And then we get you the setbacks, definitions, and of course we make sure to get you all the sources to all the viable information that's going to be key to understand if you want to do a little more due diligence. From there, what we'd like to do is a market analysis based on the commercial real estate in that area in the past 10 years. We're excited about the City of Fresno. I think it's in the top 5 largest cities in California. California, in our opinion, is one of the hottest markets right now still. There's a big population of 530,000. People are predicting that should be close to about 1 million in the next 5 years or so. So it is a city that it is growing quite a bit. And we're definitely thinking it's going to be a huge market for cannabis. And as you can see, they have a pretty large cap relative to some of these other cities. So you can expect some good amount of cannabis businesses there. So that's exciting. But what's also interesting here, once you start looking at our analysis, you can see there's been a lot of development back in 2012, and this is actually showing how much construction in square feet was going on at that period of time. But you can see these cap rates are pretty great. I mean, they're at 8%. This is the market cap rate in the area, and they've been decreasing a bit, but I mean, that's still a really good cap rate. So any real estate investors looking to get in the area, you can see that there's definitely a good opportunity there. And then we start looking down here, you can see by the color code that the vacancy rates are actually decreasing. So there's a lot of demand coming in this area, and also the asking rent and the market rent pretty low. I mean, it's a very good market. I think the real estate prices are really good, and how some of our members or even agents, how to utilize some of this data is to really negotiate with those property owners to make sure you're getting something at a good rate. As you know, if you're an operator and you start getting into very high lease rates, it starts making it very difficult to have a sustainable business based on the rent that you're paying. Now, I like what Fresno did there. They do have a very competitive tax rate in the jurisdiction, so that is very helpful, and that's what we encourage a lot of the new jurisdictions to keep doing. Make sure that it's not, don't get too greedy on the tax rates, because that's going to be very hard to keep a sustainable business as well. So a lot of good stuff here. I really highly recommend investing in the city of Fresno. It is going to be a good market, and it's definitely a growing city. Let me go into a little bit of the reg map. So here's a visualization of the regulations. Now, again, since we've been following the city for quite some time, we do have different layers in here based on some of the changes that they've been doing in the ordinance and in the draft ordinance. So we did have a different versions of the innovation zones and so forth. But right now, if we want to take a look at what that looks like, it is this little area down in, so it's going to be this little area down here. And here's where they're allowing a lot of the processing facilities. So it's definitely a good area to really focus on during the hunt. I'll cover a little bit of what we have on listings. I don't want to cover too much because it'll be unfair to our members who are on the hunt right now for real estate. But here you can see that there's quite a bit of properties. We have definitely a lot for lease currently. These are all viable. You can see a lot of these are for retail just due to the areas. And because there's a cap per council district, I think Fresno did a great job kind of spreading things out of where they might be available. Not much for sale on the market currently, but I'm sure we can, if you need assistance, I'm sure we can assist negotiating some of these places for lease, maybe purchase the lease or maybe going down that route. But there's definitely some on the market for sale, but there's a lot more for lease, which sometimes that's kind of what the most demand is locations that are viable that are for lease. But then also locations that have leases expire within the year. There's definitely a few of those, and those are definitely ones that I will recommend going after. Again, I won't go into too much detail what's going on with these because I think it'll be unfair to our members. But just to kind of give you an idea of what is going on in the city, there are properties, a lot of properties that are viable, but then there's definitely a lot that are on the market currently as well. And then here, this is a good way to really understand what's going on, where they lay in the districts to make sure that you're finding some that are kind of spread out, right? Because there is a cap per district, except for the innovation zones. So that's a little bit of what we have on the reg maps. This is available to our network members. If you're not a network member yet, please join. This is definitely a great tool and a good way to kind of get a head start on the city itself and your hunt. And as Jared mentioned, we have our compliance team is fully available right now to assist with those applications. We recommend getting a head start on these. As Council President laid out, we're looking about maybe July for applications to be available. And then hopefully by September or so, they can start approving some of these. So that's not too far away in our opinion. Again, we've been tracking this city for quite some time, and we're very excited that it's very close to accepting applications. Okay, so now I would like to open it up to some of the questions we might have. I see we definitely have a few, so I'll just kind of go down the line here, and then we'll see who's the best to kind of answer some of these questions. So first question we have here: any way to TP increase your volume? Oh, sorry guys, our volume is a little low. I apologize, I didn't catch that early on. Hopefully everyone was able to hear us a bit now. Does the Fresno agriculture community embrace or accept cannabis? Council President, would you like to answer that one?
Yeah, so I would say it's a mixed bag. It's embraced by those who want to be part of receiving a license. It's been an interesting development because historically they have completely opposed it. They have opposed it for several fronts. One, around the development of hemp as a crop, an outdoor crop. Two, on the ideological position of being, believing that's a gateway drug. That's probably 80% of the opposition. But now a few of the farmers and business leaders have now embraced it because they see the profit benefit and the operational success of it across the country. And they tend to have a lot of these commercial industrial properties in their inventory of ownership. So they're in a good position to take advantage of some of the innovation zones because they have a lot of, especially when you look at in the rural areas, we are 500,000 people in the city, but we have another 1 million people within, 15-minute drive. And in those rural communities, all the facilities that have been used for cultivation and production are all former packing sheds of vegetables and fruits. So they've benefited tremendously from the cultivation production. A few of them have gone to the retail business, but they've come around based on the capitalistic benefit.
Thank you. Okay, next question. What other cities and municipalities near Fresno are considering cannabis sales, and et cetera? Maybe Jared, is that a question you think you feel you have some information to answer on that? If not, we can pass that on to Council President.
I can tell you from our perspective as a city, just about every jurisdiction near us has already approved cannabis regulations. So all the smaller cities near us have approved. The largest really big city that is yet to do it is Bakersfield, a couple hours away. But every other city surrounding us has already approved some version of retail licenses.
Correct. Thank you.
Sorry, guys, might cut out there.
Do you want to add anything, Jared?
No, actually, the council president pretty much covered that perfectly. It's a very saturated area. Fresno certainly has the advantage in coming to the game at this very point in time.
Yeah, I would agree. Okay, next question. Are you requiring or expecting project labor agreements? It seems like that's a good question for you, Council President.
Is that labor peace agreement?
Project labor agreements?
I'm guessing he means labor peace agreement, which is going to be a requirement of the application.
Okay, we'll go on to the next one. Assuming a building will be required for application, do you consider not doing so to allow more people a chance?
Can you ask the question again?
Assuming a building will be required for application, do you consider not doing so to allow more people a chance?
No. No, and the reason for it is we have to, in our view, there's no point in giving you a retail license if you don't have a location. Because the location is going to be, without a CUP, you're not going to be able to operate. So we'd like to do both in conjunction.
I'll kind of add on to that. The operation of any type of cannabis in California is contingent on not only the municipal, but as well as state license. And per the requirements for any state license in California, you have to be able to show not only right to occupy type of permission from the landowner, which would then obviously require that you have a property prior to applying for a cannabis use license.
Thank you, Jared. And then we did get a response from Jose. Are you requiring or expecting project labor agreements? And he's saying, yeah, that's the question there. Can you touch on that, Jared? Is that familiar with you?
I am not familiar with project labor agreements. I am familiar with labor peace agreements. The labor peace agreement is going to be a requirement of the Fresno license. I don't recall seeing anywhere that a project labor agreement was going to be part of the process.
Yeah, and I can speak to that. The city historically had banned project labor agreements as a policy. But with the new council, we just approved the first project labor agreement in our history about 6 months ago related to our airport. We encourage project labor agreements across, but for these kind of operations, I doubt that a project labor agreement would be necessary because it's really renovation of buildings versus construction of multi-million-dollar projects. But if they were to propose that kind of facility and have a project labor agreement, it would be seen as very friendly by the city.
Okay, next question. Could you touch on the different license types? Jared, do you want to touch on those?
Sure. So as far as retail goes, we are going to have the equivalent of the state license. Let's see, I guess it would be a type 10 for a storefront dispensary. As mentioned earlier, the retail operations come with, the delivery option comes with the retail permit. Then we're going to have the mixture of cultivation, manufacturing, and distribution. Probably easiest to cover would be the distribution, where I believe both type 11 and the distribution only state licenses, I believe those would be permitted. Council President, could you tell me, I don't recall off the top of my head, whether manufacturing was going to be permitted on a type 6 non-volatile, or if type 7 volatile would also be allowed?
You know, I can't speak to that level of detail for the zoning, but I can tell you that the manufacturing and production, it's all going to be encouraged during in the innovation zone, and about 90% of the innovation zone is within my district. So I'm not sure. I can get back to you on that level of specificity.
Okay. Cultivation, I do believe that, let's see, so outdoor cultivation is prohibited, which would then lead us over to all of the indoor, from specialty to spa, and presuming you could find a building that would allow for upwards of a 10,000 square foot canopy. The assumption is that medium license for indoor grow would be available for permit as well. Council President, does that sound accurate to you?
Yes.
Excellent. And then I think the only license rather that we've left off the list was the testing laboratories, which has no cap or limit to the number issued. So I think that would cover all of the available license types to be permitted in the city.
That's right. Thank you, Jared. Council President, how did you guys come up with the area for the innovation zone? Why was that area chosen?
Yeah, so the reason for it is, if you know Fresno, we have an interesting geographic landscape, and in essence, all the industrial, light, commercial is kind of all centered around the 99 corridor and the 180. So that's also where we have a lot of properties and land that are prime for development, where we're encouraging development. So when you look at the 99 half mile between the 99 and the 180 west, which is kind of that coverage area, it's the freeway system exists, the off ramps already built out, the zoning is right, there isn't a lot of residential nearby. So we anticipate that these properties would easily be able to be developed without much opposition or impact to the neighborhoods. Every other part of Fresno is surrounded by residential neighborhoods, schools, and daycare. So this is kind of the area where there's plenty of open space to build up. And we think if we're gonna, we believe we're gonna be pulling a lot of, currently our customers are going to the small cities to obtain the product. And we think we're gonna be pulling from those small cities. So we wanna put them around the corridors, the transportation corridors that already exist.
Yeah, thank you for that. Do you see an issue of kind of a too much of a congestion in that area? Because it's still relatively small. Yeah, and you are right that it's pretty a lot of industrials in that area. But Is there any fear of congestion there? Is that kind of the idea, to kind of have an area where?
Yeah, the idea is to have the congestion, because we already have, like, I'll kind of give you an example. On the 41 South is where we have all the poultry plants. So that area, intentionally, we don't go and build residential nearby, because we have the Foster Farms, the, Cargills of the world, the Darlings. So we want to keep that kind of industrial use. We also learned from other cities that the smell, even though you mitigate it, can be significant. The impact to a neighborhood when it comes to the blossoming and the production of it, right? So we didn't want to put that in the middle of a residential neighborhood that wasn't developed correctly. So we kind of try to concentrate it. And, it's also in the north side of 41, and it's also the place where we have huge amount of distribution centers, the Amazons, the Altas, the Gaps. So those industrial neighbors aren't going to complain about the industrial development usage of that area.
Yeah, very, very good points. And I think that's a definitely clever idea. Okay, one more question. Let's answer this guy. Which license would you encourage landlords to obtain if they're just wanting to lease their building for cannabis activities rather than run the activities themselves?
The conditional use permit.
Yeah, and I wouldn't advise that landlords go in and provide or apply for conditional use permit on their own without having a retailer in mind. What we're looking for is to know who's going to operate it and who's going to operate the business and who's going to operate, basically own the facility. So I don't see a landlord simply applying for a CUP being successful in the process. We want to see the whole picture. Who are the operators? If you have existing licenses, where can we check to see how you're operating? We do have in Fresno a lot of folks who have a vast amount of commercial properties, and they would like to strike agreements with multiple retailers and increase their likelihood of one of their potential tenants receiving a license. We actually put a provision in there that people cannot essentially do that, because what we want is to get a clear picture of, is that location the right location? Can it be mitigated? Is the operator basically in good standing? Do they have a good operational plan? So we'd like to see the whole picture.
Council President, if I may ask, does that mean the city would consider allowing property owners to stack multiple applications on their property in case
Yeah, we're not going to do that either. It's actually something that was asked of us to include a provision that would allow them to do that. Allow the same property owner to be part of 10 different applications. And what we've said is there's plenty of properties in Fresno that we have strip malls left and right that are empty. There may not be a lot of stuff available for sale, but there's a lot of stuff available for leasing and operating. So what we've said is we'd like you to have one location, one operator, and give us the best picture of what the operation would look like. It didn't make some of the local landlords happy, but as I tell folks, there's no guarantee here, and you have to figure out who you're going to take down the aisle. You can't bring 10 different options.
Right. And another reason why to start early, guys.
Not just that.
And what we also saw is landlords were getting $50,000 security deposits irrespective, and bumping up to 75,000. And it doesn't make sense to also put potential applicants in that position where they're just going to be hijacked up front.
Right, exactly. And we see that quite a bit in a lot of other cities, stacking applications, but also property owners taking advantage of that and asking for non-refundable deposits and so forth. So again, guys, that's why it's important to kind of start early. This is why we want to do these things early and get you access to what the lay of the land looks like, and then we can help you with the hunting.
Yeah, and keep in mind from our perspective, just the last point I would make is we also took a lot of lessons from the saturation of liquor stores and liquor licenses in the city. We have the highest concentration and saturation in the state of California. And what we found in that experience is you have one property owner, and every time he gets in trouble, he switches the provider or the license holder of the ABC license. And then it becomes back and forth figuring out who owns it today. And it goes on for 50, 20 years. So we're basically saying we're not going to allow you to replicate the ABC problem that we have in the city, where a ton of people got stuff, and now, you know, water is cheaper, beer is cheaper than water because there's like 5 liquor stores in the same corner, and it's now a deterioration of the neighborhood. So we think this industry is going to be an add-on. It's going to improve neighborhoods, but we also want to make sure that we have full accountability of the property owner and the business, so they're not just pointing fingers at each other.
That's an excellent assurance to be able to offer the community that was a little hesitant to enter into this market until this point. I think that's wonderful to hear, Council President. Certainly it highlights opportunity for companies such as Cannabis Real Estate Consultants, as we have the ability to not only show mapping and help people to identify the properties, or property owners to identify their own properties as eligibility, but as well, we work directly with licensing and the tenant operators to help them match up on the terms that the city will approve.
And what I encourage all of you is, as you're looking at properties, what I've told folks is, spend some time with your local council members of that area. Most of them have been open to meeting with all of those before the wall goes up. Because what you'll find is sometimes our data files are not as accurate. So when they put up the map in 18, I found that half of the buffer variables were completely inaccurate. Schools had been closed 5 years ago. Daycares no longer existed, a whole bunch of stuff that disqualified certain properties. So spend some time with the council members. They'll tell you too, like, you know, property A that's eligible now is great, but we're 6 months away from breaking ground on a brand new school next door. So it's those kind of things that you definitely want to check in with some of the locals, and our folks have been pretty responsive on giving you feedback and what they know, and then letting you all make the choice that you prefer to make.
Yeah, that's correct. Actually, we did see that map, and actually we corrected a lot of those things in ours, because yeah, it's important to know that, you know, that school's actually there or not. And you mentioned a good point. If one's in development, that's a very key thing to know, because the application process will take some time. So
speaking of which, we actually had one more question just pop in, guys. Council President, the question was, how long do you think it will take to get through the CUP process?
Given that you don't have to do the EIR, I think you go to airport planning, city council within 30 to 60 days.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a very competitive
our goal here
timeline.
was to spend the time up front, you know, in the EIR process and the application process, so that we don't have to delay it in the back end.
From doing application work, I would typically consider any type of response to a regulatory application in 90 days to be rather fast. So thank you, Council President. I think it's well worth it to your future applicants that you have put the time in up front.
Yep, and I will just end with this. We do anticipate making up to 21 licenses available when we announce the applications. So that just requires a simple majority vote of the council, and I anticipate once we receive, you know, whatever hundreds of applications, that we're just going to say, let's just do them all now, and not wait for a third round or second round.
That's excellent news.
Wonderful. Okay, so Council President Miguel, I appreciate you joining us today. This is very insightful. There's a lot of good information here. Okay, thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you all. Have a good one.
Yeah, so guys, we'll be updating this on the blog. This will be this webinar recording will be on the blog as well. If you haven't yet, join the network. We can get you access to these type of things as a reg maps. Jared, thank you so much for going through some of those tips and what the process might look like. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Council President.